Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the next episode in the Race to Zero webinar series organized by the Hong Kong Institute of Certified Public Accountants. In previous episodes, you've heard from the IFRS Foundation on aligning sustainability reporting standards. Today, our topic is taking the greenwash out of green financial products. My name is Jonathan Drew. I lead the ESG Solutions Group at HSBC, and it's my great honor to have been asked to moderate our conversation this afternoon with three preeminent constituents of the Hong Kong green finance and investment ecosystem. We are joined this afternoon by Alexandra Young, who is the Senior Director of Investment Products at the Securities and Futures Commission here in Hong Kong. We're also joined by Calvin Kwon, who is Head of Sustainability and Risk Governance for Link REIT, as well as Prashant Vaiz, who is the Senior Policy Fellow at the Climate Bonds Initiative. For any of you who miraculously haven't heard of the Climate Bonds Initiative, they're a crucial provider, not only of data, recorder of transactions, provider of commentary on transactions, convener of experience sharing sessions, but also a builder of taxonomies and developer of standards. And so I'm delighted to invite Prashant to provide a foundation for the conversation this afternoon by sharing his perspective on the topic and provide a summary of where we are on critical issues such as those taxonomies and standards. Prashant, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan, for those very kind comments. And it's so nice to be back in Hong Kong. It's been quite some time. I used to live there for 3 years, so it's most welcome. What I'm going to try doing with this talk is explain to you a little bit about how we really drive up the volume of investment going into the green economy. We all know instinctively what that means. It means greener buildings, more renewable energy. But there's always this slight kind of worry that what is green enough? Is a beam plus building sufficiently green? Is a hybrid car sufficiently green? So what I shall be talking about is the system of taxonomies, which is the kind of jargon for whether something is sufficiently green as to meet our environmental expectations and ensure investors that they're actually making a valid contribution to the huge challenge ahead of us of decarbonising our economy. I'll be speaking for about 15 minutes, and I'm just going to sort of give you a bit of an overview, a flavour for what kind of taxonomical developments are taking place around the world. Some of the kind of other terminology about standards and taxonomies. And then I'm going to focus a little bit on how we actually look at a couple of the important taxonomies around the world, particularly Chinese and the EU one. And then also think a little bit about other potential users of taxonomies, and particularly central banks and SFC, I guess, as well. So let's start off by just explaining a little bit about green taxonomy. I think, as Jonathan has indicated, one of the kind of the big objectives of the taxonomy is to stop greenwashing. So what we want to do is make sure that we kind of agree on a way of actually defining green, which is not just making a tokenistic gesture towards it, but making a valid and significant contribution. The second one is that a lot of investment, I don't need to say this to a Hong Kong audience, is international in scope. And what international investors are looking for is definitions of green that will satisfy their own domestic investor audience. So we need to make sure that capital flows from Europe, Japan, America, the appropriate kind of standards of green are being applied. And one of the things that my own organization has been quite heavily involved with is sovereign green bond issuances. And Hong Kong is a particularly larger example of a sovereign green bond, where government is going through its own kind of expenditures and identifying those which are worthy of kind of bringing to the attention of bond and gilt government bond investors. One important point I want to make at the outset is a taxonomy is just one small piece of the jigsaw. And what this graphic is trying to do is remind us of some of the other kind of pieces of this jigsaw. So what these 10 different headings are the kind of the building blocks that the EU action plan has identified as sort of constituting the sustainable finance package of work. So number one is the taxonomy itself. So this is a definition of what is green and what is not green. The second is the standards and labels. So the standard, and I'm going to go into this in a bit more detail, is the process by which we are issuers are identifying sufficiently green assets and then bringing them to the market. The other two boxes I've kind of identified in green are kind of where the you guys come in. It's really the disclosures obligations being put upon corporate issuers and corporate borrowers. So these are things where the accountants are going to play a very, very important role. And group number 7 is another EU regulation, which is the disclosure requirements on the financial market participants. So by this, I'm talking about the unit funds, other large kind of institutional investors. And as well as these kind of sort of important ones for the perspective of this talk, there's a whole bunch of 6 other kind of building blocks. One is developing benchmarks to make sure that when unit trusts are developed, which are just following an index, there's a suitable index. Another one is identifying government expenditure programs on their kind of green journey. Number 5 here is this idea that if for retail funds, so if you have a retail client, there's a process by which the financial advisor gives accurate advice to the small investor. And then boxes 8, 9, and 10 are really the other parts of the kind of financial market. So number 8 is the potential requirements which Hong Kong MA might introduce to try to make these greener. Research and ratings is making sure that the credit rating agencies do their bit. And then number 10 is on the governance, to make sure that within corporates there's a governance structure to identify and strategize about green investments. So this is the kind of package of overall measures that the EU is envisaging, and taxonomy is just one part of this. The second thing I wanted to draw attention to is the taxonomy defines what is within scope of being green and what isn't. It sets a sort of delineation, saying that this power station is green, this is renewable, this power station is not, this is burning coal. But what the Green Bond Standard is doing is setting by a process of actually from, if you're in Kelvin's shoes and you're trying to identify, here are some buildings that Linkreach is operating, identifying from its portfolio what type of expenditures are doing and ensuring that they're being aligned with the taxonomy. Then developing a prospectus or a green bond framework and then using this to market the issuance. And then having a process by someone independent is making sure that the framework is being adhered to. And that's where the mandatory verification comes in. And finally, when the investment has arrived and the money is sitting in the bank, there's actually a reporting process to make sure that after year after year after year, as for the duration of the bond, we can make sure that the funds are being allocated as we promised it would be, and ideally what the carbon savings are from this investment. Now, here's some kind of an idea of what the kind of building blocks of a taxonomy are. The first bubble at the top is really defining what the environmental objectives are. So in order to identify something that's green, you need to figure out green by what criteria. So is it by climate? Is it by adaptation? Is it by biodiversity? Next is actually deciding what kind of disaggregation of the economy one needs to operate at. So it's if you are trying to fix particular thresholds or measurements, they need to be applicable to the industry. So for instance, for an electricity sector, it might be emissions per kilowatt hour of electricity or gas being delivered. For a vehicle, it might be per vehicle kilometre travelled. And then lastly, and this is the most contentious bit, is the thresholds. What level is green enough? There's no such thing as a free lunch. No matter how much Kelvin might try, it's highly unlikely he'll ever deliver a completely zero carbon building, at least from the existing building stock. So what's an appropriate threshold? this is just a little bit of marketing on my part. I hope you don't mind. But this is some of the sort of taxonomies in development around the world. And you can see that the deep green ones are at a high level of development, and the ones that are in light green are either being mooted or in the process of being developed. And here in Asia, the PBOC and other regulators in China have developed a very well articulated taxonomy in China. Mongolia has developed a taxonomy which is very closely aligned to China. Russia has drafted one as well. Kazakhstan is talking about it. And within the ASEAN region, there's both one at the ASEAN level and individual countries like Singapore, Malaysia are developing taxonomies. And I'm involved myself in the India taxonomy work too. And there's a whole bunch of other taxonomies elsewhere in the world. One thing to notice here is that the kind of the prime mover behind these taxonomies is often different. So in Singapore, it's the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, that's sort of the prime mover. And similarly in Malaysia, it's the central bank. In other jurisdictions, it might be different people. It might be the financial regulator like SFC, or it could be an industry-led one. So the actual vehicle by which this agreement is solicited and achieved can differ from country to country. What I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about two of the really important and most developed taxonomies, which are the EU and the Chinese ones, and then go on to talk a little bit about the common ground, which is this kind of conversation that's taking place between Europe and China about how international investors can ensure that they're not having a sort of a hodgepodge of different taxonomies everywhere around the world, that there is some kind of common framework. Now, let's just think a little bit about what the sources of difference might be between taxonomies. And especially this is important when we recognize that investment flows move across countries. So an investment fund that's been set up in Hong Kong or Ireland or whatever, the actual capital itself might be allocated elsewhere. So what might vary is that the sectors being covered might vary. At the moment, the EU one excludes agriculture, for instance. So there's no definition of agricultural standards. The thresholds might vary. So, for instance, what might be deemed as being green enough in one jurisdiction might not be green enough in another jurisdiction. And one point of contention has been whether clean coal is in or out. And certainly that differed between China and Europe. And it's at the moment a point of contention between the Indian developing taxonomy and the European one. The third one is that it's all very well there being this kind of congruence on climate mitigation. But how about all those other things we care about? How about things like whether biodiversity is looked after, or the social needs of people, of justice in terms of relocating people when a hydro dam is built? And the hardest one is where there's entirely different performance metrics being selected. So, for instance, whether a building is green enough might be quite different if we're using BEAM Plus, or whether we're using something like an energy performance certificate in the EU, or whether we're using a very, very measured energy use per meter squared every year. So completely different metrics altogether. I'm going to just do a very, very quick slide on a side-by-side comparison between the EU, just to explain a little bit about some of the differences that arise. Within the EU, the sort of the prime mover behind the development was the EU Commission. But what they did was they kind of enlisted some industry participants, think tanks, academics through three different groups, which we call HLEG, then TEG, and currently the Platform for Sustainable Framework. But the actual legislation or the regulation was done by the Commission. Within China, it's been very much a kind of regulator-led one. So the PBOC, the NDRC, and the CSRC have been sort of the prime movers. Because of these kind of different setups, the actual regulatory form differs. So for the lawyers amongst you, in the EU, it's actually a regulation, which is a very kind of open-ended thing. And then there's a delegated act, which is essentially a secondary legislation, which allows the actual thresholds and stuff to be defined and modified from year to year. Within China, because it's regulator-led, it's done by regulatory guidelines. For reasons I'll explain in my next slide, the coverage is quite different. So within EU, something like 40% of listed companies come within scope of the sectors that are covered. But more importantly, the vast majority, 80% of emissions come within scope. Within China, it's a slightly different setup, but it looks at different levels of industrial disaggregation. You can see it's actually a slightly narrower set of industry. And as well as climate mitigation, which is obviously common to all, there are different environmental themes. I've listed the ones for the European system, which is climate mitigation, adaptation, protection of waterways, circular economy and waste, pollution prevention and control, and the biodiversity and looking after of ecosystems. Now, in China, they're defined a little bit differently. They're using three different headings, but effectively the coverage is the same. So in reality, all of them strive to achieve most of the environmental outcomes, at least make a significant contribution to at least one of them, and not mess up the other five. Now, I'll go into a little bit of a detail, and it just shows the difficulty of actually comparing and then coming up with a common ground taxonomy. The fundamental unit of scrutiny in China is the project level. And the way that the sectors were identified was looking at these 6 different kind of parts of the environmental services industry and figuring out which of these 6 buckets the things fit in. So it could either be to do with energy saving, clean manufacture, clean energy, land restoration, green infrastructure upgrades, or green services. And by services, it's the kind of everything from consulting to the kind of work that accountants do as well. But the fundamental kind of idea here was you identify things by the environmental industry for which the investment is being sought, and then you have subsectors and subsectors and subsectors. We have beyond that. Within the EU, the kind of fundamental level of scrutiny was actually the activity. The activity was defined by something called a NACE classification, which is the EU speak for the Standard Industrial Classification System. And there, the fundamental kind of units were either for electricity sector, for the building sector, for transportation sector, for land use, for manufacturing, for energy efficiency. So even though the starting was a little bit different, they ended up in a very similar place, really. Now, I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm a bit conscious of time. Because of this strong desire to assist international capital flows, the IPSF, which is essentially a group within the EU, it convened a grouping of, at the moment, around 20 different countries, but it's growing all the time, to try to work together to help ensure that sustainable financial flows internationally can arise. One of their early projects was to define a kind of commonalities between the EU and the Chinese taxonomy. This IPSF kind of project at the moment is not envisaging any legal changes. So there's no kind of change in the PBOC and Chinese regulatory system, nor is there any change in the EU one. That's not part of the mandate. What they're trying to do is find where there's commonalities. And what they've ended up doing is essentially going through on a line-by-line basis exactly what the thresholds are, exactly what the industrial coverage is, and exactly what these other 5 environmental themes, how well they're being treated. Even though it's not stated so, this is effectively becoming the international common standard. At least that's the hope. I mean, if EU and China agree on this and other countries are start to align to us, then effectively it'll become a common standard. One of the sort of strong benefits of this is there's massive network benefits. So a fund manager in Europe can know that if it meets the common standard from this international framework, he doesn't need to worry about looking at the nitty-gritty of each project by project. If a verifier has told him in China, yep, it meets the common standard, he can be self-assured that it meets the EU standard as well. And we're currently awaiting the actual publication of this report. It's meant to be in autumn. But one kind of early hint was the PBOC's Yixing, who's I think the governor there, said his kind of understanding is there's something like an 80% alignment between the EU and Chinese taxonomies. Okay, that's just an explanation of the coverage at the moment of the EU platform of the members. Importantly, it also includes some other big economies like India, like Indonesia as well. So far, I've been talking about green taxonomies. And green taxonomies are really important for ensuring that capital flows of investors wanting to invest in green things have a suitable kind of taxonomy. There is a different agenda as well. And this different agenda is the agenda of the central banks and maybe the SFC as well. And this is to identify which assets represent a significant systemic risk to the financial system. So these aren't things which are just quite green. These are things that are at risk of, in a few years' time, undermining a bank's balance sheet. So this idea of a significant harm taxonomy is actually to identify the small parts of the economy which will quite possibly, either because they're highly exposed to physical risks from climate, or because they are undertaking activities which are likely to become uneconomic, or they have their assets written down by climate mitigation policy. It's trying to identify those type of things. The users of this kind of taxonomy will be the internal managements in the clients. So any company that you're might be curious about, well, here are some assets which are wholly dedicated only to activities which cannot become green. And these, in a few years' time, might become stranded. And the other users might be central banks and regulators who are interested in ensuring that in a few years ahead, when net zero ambitions of governments are giving rise to policy changes, that there aren't any kind of large write-downs of assets which are causing instability in the financial system. Other potential users might be index providers. So for instance, some funds might be interested in not particularly investing in pure deep green policy investments, but they're interested in investing in fund companies which are not investing in fossil fuels or avoiding coal. Some of the caveats when sort of developing this taxonomy, and the reason why it's becoming so slow, is that it's actually quite difficult to identify which assets are on a balance sheet of a financial institution from the data that's presently held. So if you look at the kind of data that a typical bank or investment fund might hold, identifying exactly how much exposure there is, for instance, to coal might be quite difficult. And the second point is that issuers are unlikely to voluntarily come forward to and publicize the fact that they have assets which are vulnerable, something they might wish to quietly manage behind the scenes and develop strategies internally. I've just done a quick slide just identifying the type of risks that might give rise to this risk, and this is things like extreme weather. Some of the transition risks are quite important as well. So there might be a change in public policy. And so, for instance, this sort of shift where we're suddenly moving away from petrol engine vehicles, it means it's some of the petrol engine vehicle manufacturers might be at risk. There might be things like just changing sentiments. So, for instance, in some countries, consumers are flying less because they're seeing it as something that's environmentally damaging, perhaps. There might be other issues where the entire business model is disruptive. So some of the things that Tesla are doing, where they're investing in batteries and technologies like that, it disrupts some of the kind of activities that some of the markets are facilitating, which will profit from instability in electricity prices. Just one thing just to bear in mind, that some of the kind of significant harm taxonomies, they could go down the taxonomical approach where we're identifying sectors and thresholds. That's one way of going. Or another one, which is what central banks are currently sort of advocating, is that they're asking banks and insurance companies who they supervise to undertake a kind of climate value at risk probabilistic assessment of their balance sheets. So it might be something that's the accountancy profession gets highly involved with, but it might not. It's still a bit experimental. There are some big challenges to the significant harm taxonomy, and I just thought I'd mention these. There's some significant politics in this. It means quite a lot of kind of issues for the industry that's being affected. There are difficulties in gathering information, especially given that issuers and borrowers and financial institutions might not necessarily volunteer this information. It'll have to be done with a degree of kind of compulsion. And there are issues, obviously, of when you have a particular asset that's owned at an individual level, how much threat there is to the balance sheet of the company as a whole, given that it might only be a small part of the company's business activities. And certainly in Hong Kong, where you have large conglomerate companies, the balance sheet of the company as a whole might be actually quite robust. It's just individual small bits of it that might be a bit vulnerable. Okay, my lasting slide is really, this is an immense opportunity, I think, for the accountancy profession. There is going to be, inevitably, I think, as this wall of trillions of dollars of investment flows in green and in sustainability, it's only going to grow. But we should remind ourselves that green is not the only thing on the kind of agenda. So at the moment, the focus is very much on sort of the deep green renewables, green transportation. But coming down the line, some of the other big kind of industrial activities are within kind of scope. That's the transition label. There's a whole bunch of other labels. Last year, because of COVID, we saw a massive expansion of sustainability bonds and social bonds. There are other things like blue bonds, which are to do with investment into the water sector. So at the moment, I think this kind of carbon labeling is at the forefront, but the markets are likely to grow over time into these other things. And this is the kind of investments and the kind of process we want to ensure that the Hong Kong economy and the world economy becomes green. Thank you very much.
Prashant, thank you so much for setting that out. I think you've set that great foundation, raised so many so many critical issues there, and you picked up at the end there, and I'm sure you've got all of the audience excited about increased regulation driving a more mandatory disclosure, and hence a need for further assurance around that disclosure. There's nothing like that to get a group of accountants excited, I'm sure. But before we just go there, I just wanted to sort of come back to you, and before allowing you to take a breath, Prashant, just stepping back and thinking about those drivers, and interested in your views, because we've started to talk about solutions, but before we go there, how big is this problem? How big do you see the problem of greenwashing? I mean, it's a nasty word. Nobody likes to be accused of greenwashing. Is it a real problem?
It is a real problem. I mean, some of the kind of assessments that have been done is that a lot of the historical funds have been set up with no sort of malice intended, but they just simply used lower kind of thresholds. So what we find is that a lot of the kind of ESG funds are there with a relatively kind of minor exclusion criteria. So that's one type of greenwash. It's where a fund just systematically excludes tobacco or armaments and those kind of things. I think what a lot of investors are really looking for is the investments that will make a substantial contribution to the environmental problems that we have. And at the moment, that's still only a very, very small minority of funds. And that's why we're seeing that at the moment, something like 1 trillion of funds investments are currently in properly green investments. And given that we've got something like 200 trillion worth of investments altogether globally, this is actually a rather small part of it.
Interesting, thank you, mate. I'd like to bring Alexandra in at this point, because as a regulator, I mean, your role is about protecting investor interests. So how do you start to go about this in your work, Alexandra?
I think in terms of retail funds, which is my area, we're very much a disclosure-based regime. So what that means in essence is if you market your product as a ESG product, then we would expect you to be able to explain how you're doing the ESG assessments, what your underlying investments are, and things like that. So, I mean, these are already concepts that are embedded in our usual authorization process and the authorization requirements for public funds. But when we started looking at ESG funds back in 2018, we noticed that there were funds which had ESG references in their names, and we looked at the disclosures. And they really varied quite widely. There were some funds which had pretty good disclosures, but then there were some funds which had nearly no references to how or why they called themselves ESG funds. So we thought it was important as an initial step to put in not so much requirements, but because the requirements were there already, but to explain how these requirements would work for funds which claimed to be ESG funds. So what we did was to issue a circular to say, so in offering documents, when you call yourself an ESG fund, this is what we expect your disclosures to include. So that was an initial step, and we issued that circular in 2019. In the last 2 years, there's been a huge influx of funds calling themselves ESG funds, and we've seen lots more different types of strategies and things that these funds were doing. And then, of course, in Europe, there has been the rollout of their sustainability disclosure financial regulation, the SFDR, which basically requires European funds to categorize themselves as either Article 6 or Article 8 or Article 9 funds, and then to do appropriate disclosures. Now, the difference is Article 6 funds are usually funds which have very low levels of, I would call low levels of ESG integration. They're usually just integrated in their assessment or investment processes. So they might not really have a green or ESG focus. Then you have the Article 9 funds, which are the funds that have to have ESG investment objectives. And these are usually funds which have already adopted some kind of accepted taxonomy. And then you have the Article 8 funds, which is the real problem area. It's the funds which have an element of ESG, more than the integration, but not an objective. we studied all of that, and we thought it was time that we might need to update our circular, which we did, and we just rolled out recently. And we thought of adopting the European approach, but that approach with the funds, we weren't very comfortable with the Article 8 type of funds, because in addition to this disclosure regime that we have, we also have an SFC website, web page, where we have these ESG funds that we've authorized that comply with our circular. So it's sort of like a label. And we were very conscious that if we were just putting on all kinds of light green funds onto our website, then we would be facilitating greenwashing. That was a long discussion that we actually had internally. So what we've done is, for our website our list, these have got to be funds which have ESG as a key investment focus. So it's slightly different from an investment objective. So if the fund has very robust strategies, it might not be an ESG objective, then we would consider that to be an ESG fund for the purposes in Hong Kong, and they would have to comply with the offering document disclosure requirements. And we also have, in the new circular, we also have an additional requirement, which is for periodic assessment and reporting on how the fund has attained its stated ESG focus. So hopefully that would also give investors a sense of not only what the fund claims it wants to do and how it does it, but at the end of the year, how it's done so far. It might have done very poorly, but they would have had a chance to explain why, or it might have done very well. Right. So that's the idea.
There are a lot of complex concepts in there. I can imagine that the retail investor, the mom and pop, to understand the difference between an Article 6, 7, 8, 9 fund is going to be the chance of confusion seems very high.
I think in terms of the actual offering documents that the investors would see, they won't see Article 6, 8. We don't require that disclosure for Hong Kong. Right. So, but what we would expect is they need to explain how they're doing whatever they claim they're doing, and the details of the investments, the underlying investments. So, right. For example, the easiest ones are the thematic funds. So we would expect, in the case of a thematic fund, that it would have at least, say, 70% of its investments invested in underlying assets, which, say, a clean water fund in clean water companies, something like that. Right. So there are some specific disclosure requirements, but we try not to have too much technical disclosures, because that's quite off-putting for retail investors as well. But it's a fine balance.
And it's a disclosure really of approach rather than a disclosure of data. I'm coming towards the concept of what gets assured here when the investor looks at the fund.
There would be data as well. I think we're expecting more data in terms of the other areas which the Commission's working on. So we have the other very big project, and I think the consultation conclusions are coming up soon, maybe even tomorrow, are the integration, climate risk integration requirements for fund managers. Right. And that would have data requirements in them.
Right. And to come back to Prashant's point about thresholds, and the problem of greenwashing is where somebody's just using a very low threshold. So, all right, there's no Arctic drilling in here, so it's an ESG fund. Are thresholds part of your review?
They are for investment products. They are, when we look at products, we would look at thresholds. It depends on the type of fund, the strategy that they're doing. We don't have a lot of thresholds in our requirements at the moment for the ESG funds, because the tax, if there was a fund that had adopted a recognized taxonomy, we'd be really, really happy, but a lot of them don't. So we would be asking lots of questions to get comfortable that this is a fund which does adopt stringent strategies, or it's usually for thematic funds it's easier because we would have that 70% threshold, but for other strategies it's less easy.
Yes. Calvin, I have to bring you in now, because you're an issuer. You're creating these green, sustainable investment opportunities through the various forms of paper that you're putting into the market. I mean, how do you go about doing that, listening to Alexandra in terms of sort of what she's looking at when she's saying, well, I want to know what, whether, the underlying investments in this fund are doing this or not? How do you approach that from the issuer side?
Well, thanks. I think if we take a look over the last few years, how this has developed, I think both of us, if I recall, were grinning when you were saying, we actually welcome more regulation. In this aspect, I absolutely agree, because with more regulation and clarity on what's being expected, issuers will have a better understanding, okay, what do I need to prepare for? When I start thinking about the use of proceeds, do I actually have these projects in place? Will this project qualify? And we can already start planning a lot of these issues before we go ahead and do that issuance. We then can start planning, what type of resources we might need to fulfill the reporting requirements as well. And the beauty about this is now we're starting to have essentially a checklist that we can follow. And know, okay, these are the key steps that we have to go through. If we meet these minimum requirements, at least we know that there's going to be a good chance that this can qualify for ESG recognition, or we reduce that greenwashing. I think from our experience, going back to 2016 when we issued our first one, I think we're kind of learning on the fly, setting what is a acceptable benchmark for energy efficiency, what should that benchmark be for building standards and so forth. But now we're seeing alignment across different jurisdictions, and also regulatory side. So for
you had to bring neighbors into Hong Kong, I remember.
Yes. We were looking at that. We were looking at whether HK Beam, LEED, BREEAM certification, which one, how do these compare? But now with this focus towards the taxonomy and alignment of it, we have a better understanding. Even energy efficiency. Again, whether it was, I think we argued before about, is it 10%, 20%, 30% reduction, what's good? And even then we were just getting recommendations from some of the assurance agencies. They didn't have a good idea, but now that's no longer the case. So that kind of deals with all that greenwashing question right away. Again, in my opinion, I think this is a very welcome exercise.
Yes, you're saying regulation is good, but I'm a bit of a skeptic, Calvin. I mean, you're not saying all regulation is good. No. Clearly, good regulation is good. And where can regulation go wrong, and might it hinder you in your efforts to communicate your story ultimately to investors?
Well, so again, for this side, the regulation side in this situation is good because it gives us that step by step. The difficult part is when you essentially transplant regulations from other jurisdictions into another location without taking into account the nuances of specific geographies, right? So one of the challenges that could have come up is actually just taking the EU taxonomy and implementing into China, or implementing into Hong Kong without taking into account the local situation, the cultures, and so forth. But I think so far we've seen that both of these jurisdictions, Hong Kong, China, and so forth, have been very cognizant about that. We've taken the necessary steps to adopt the good things from the EU taxonomy, tweak it a little bit to fit the model here, whether it's the growth and economic models that we have in the region, or even just the general situations that we have here as well. So it's not just transplanting the whole thing over here, it's adapting and adopting.
And perhaps using Prashant's analysis, those sort of three building blocks of the taxonomy.
Yep.
Is it certain bits of that need to be tailored for, the local market conditions?
Absolutely. I think some of this has been, if you look at mainland China itself, right, they set their carbon neutral target to be 2060. And there's a whole reason behind it, whether it's the economic growth, how they project the country will grow, which sectors will be changing, which sectors will hit essentially that peak carbon emissions. And that's all factored in that growth plan. And therefore, they have to kind of adjust their taxonomy to allow for their kind of growth plan, growth strategy. So, with the building blocks objectives are absolutely clear. The sector breakdown is very important, especially for mainland China. Hong Kong, maybe not so much because real estate, finance, fewer sectors. And then the threshold is actually going to be one of the keys. What's acceptable in Europe, what's acceptable in Australia, America, and what's acceptable in Asia, because we're all in very different phases of growth. And that makes it a little bit challenging. Again, that goes back to that you can't just transplant that regulation or that that set of rules into a location without making sure that we tweak it just a little bit.
Yeah, I can feel Prashant behind me twitching here. Prashant, I have to come to you. Is that okay to have different thresholds in different markets?
I think I agree with Calvin on certain aspects of this. I mean, there needs to be regional variation. I mean, the taxonomy in New Zealand, for understandable reasons, is focused very much on agriculture, which is currently excluded from the EU taxonomy because the economic makeup of the region is different. In other areas, environmental priorities might be somewhat different. So the Malaysian taxonomy makes specific reference to things like mangroves, which, for obvious reasons, in the EU is not an interest. The issue that you're talking about is setting the thresholds differently. I mean, remind ourselves what the objective is so that at a global level, we can achieve the Paris Agreement as cost effectively as possible. By Paris Agreement, we're talking about stabilizing temperatures. Now, because CO2 is itself a kind of a global pollutant and a global problem, it's not, I don't think it's valid to say that the standards should be different from place to place. What is needed is some kind of mechanism to ensure compensation if a particular country has got a different, some of the different stage of the growth path. So I do a lot of work in India. India at the moment is like 60-70% coal-fired, and its emissions per capita are a fraction of EU. So quite legitimately, India is saying that the challenge for us to decarbonize is different to yours. But the underlying engineering issue is not that different. I mean, solar panels are cheap in India. They're very cheap. So solar PV is cheap, but at the moment it lacks the finance to invest in it adequately. So I would argue, Jonathan, that rather than setting the thresholds differently, we ensure that the kind of funding mechanisms actually identify and appropriately fund low-cost opportunities anywhere in the world. And that's why we're so eager to see international capital flows, if at a reasonable cost, in regions where they're needed.
Interesting. But how then would that, let's take an emerging market context, how would that compensation mechanism then work? Because your proposition sort of to the growing economy is saying, well, you've got to have the same standards, but don't worry, because there's going to be some financial compensation coming from somewhere. And obviously, one of the big, gripes, complaints, yes, let's be direct, from the emerging markets today is we haven't seen any of that promised capital from the rich countries transferred to us under the COP mechanisms.
And we would agree with them. I mean, at the moment, the COP mechanisms, Paris Agreement promised 100 billion. Where is it? So that is a genuine problem. I mean, if you look at the different sort of strategies by countries, I mean, what China has done is promised a net zero target, which is 10 years later. India, the real kind of ambition in India is to get India to commit to a peaking year, so a year in which their emissions stop growing, which is still a major achievement given that its emissions per capita is still so low. And then in terms of the capital flows, I mean, there's no simple solution to this because this is a global problem, but the global capital flows and the global subsidized capital flows have not followed. And there's no getting away from this. I mean, even Alok Sharma, who's the president of the COP, the ex-UK minister, has been saying pretty much the same thing. So obviously he's somebody who's from an Indian background, but now represents the UK government. But it's the same observation. We need to make this capital available. And in a way, my organisation is talking about a sort of a Marshall Plan level of capital flows.
Yes, the new Green Deal, absolutely. So Alexandra, then, in playing your part and trying to get the product with confidence in front of the retail pool, let's consider the pool to be very, very important. Then, what, in your analysis, what sort of does good look like when you come to sort of say, yeah, that's the one I want to endorse?
I think honestly speaking, I don't think we do an assessment of what is very good. We would have this benchmark. So if your disclosures are good enough, or if you have where we have threshold requirements and you meet the threshold requirements. So in our terminology, if you have ESG focus and you comply with our disclosure requirements, then you get onto the SFC ESG funds list. Right. For the funds which don't meet these criteria, it's not that we won't allow you to market yourself. You can still sell that fund, provided that you meet our other authorization requirements, but you can't market yourself as an ESG fund. So that's what we do. And then because in the Hong Kong market, we do have a fair number of European funds, And in Europe, they might be European ESG funds, but they don't meet our requirement. And there are a few of those, they're not a lot, with ESG references in their name. So those funds, because they really have difficulties changing their fund names because the primary market regulators already approved the fund plus the name. So what we do is we've got a warning underneath the name of the fund saying this is not a SFC authorized or Hong Kong ESG fund that complies with our requirements. So investors, in theory, if they see that note, they should know that by the SFC standards, we don't think these funds are green enough or ESG enough.
Right.
Yeah. So that's still where we are at the moment, but hopefully when the more taxonomies and things in place, then we will revise the circular again and tighten things up, because it's that the changes, there's so many developments that's developing so fast. We thought we'd better get something out to address the existing problem, because with the European requirements, we've had an influx of funds wanting to do changes and market themselves as ESG funds. When we started out, we had about 20. We have 62 now.
Yes.
And that's 2 years. Yeah.
So it's sort of step one is to sort of weed out the weeds or the laggards, whatever, however you, I'm sure you have a nice polite word for them. And then step two is to raise the bar and, and maybe create different categories eventually.
We're raising the bar slowly.
Yes. And how does your approach compare? You reference regulations in other regions. How does it approach? Who's getting the greener fund? Somebody buying here in Hong Kong or somebody buying in Paris?
Well, if you said Europe in general, I'd say in Hong Kong. But then the Hong Kong funds are also, a lot of our ESG funds also use its funds. It's just that the labeling's a little different. They've got these Article 8 and Article 9 funds, whereas our standard, I'd like to think that our standard is a little bit higher, because a lot of the Article 8 funds, which are marketed as ESG funds in Europe, they don't meet our criteria.
Right. France
is a little bit different because they've got their own local market requirements, which are quite stringent.
Maybe you could just explain UCITS a little bit to those, perhaps those who are not.
The UCITS is the, I'm so used to this term. It's the European legislation governing collective investment schemes. So it's
So we've got funds that meet those criteria but don't meet your.
In terms of the ESG.
In terms of ESG.
Yeah, but in the ones that meet, I should say that the disclosure requirements are very similar. It's just that it's the threshold for being an ESG fund. So in Europe, if you have some element of ESG, you could be, if it's integration, you're called in Article 6 under their sustainability disclosure financial regulations, or the SFDR. If you have an ESG objective, then you're an Article 9 fund, and those Article 9 funds generally would meet our requirements, our threshold for becoming an ESG fund. But in Europe, a lot of the Article 8 funds, they just have some element of ESG in it,
right? And
those wouldn't meet our. So for instance, it might be a fund which just adopted some exclusionary strategy, a very basic one. So we don't invest in tobacco. That could be an Article 8 fund. There's a lot of discussion as to what falls under an Article 8 fund in Europe at the moment. For funds which have those simple types of exclusionary strategies, we don't consider them to be ESG funds.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. And what's the population of ESG approved retail funds in Hong Kong today?
We have, I believe, 62.
62. And
we have, I think, over 2,000 funds.
Right.
But it's a fast growing market, because when we started the exercise, we had about 20. And we're seeing new ones coming in every week.
Interesting. And quite a broad range of themes, approaches.
Yes, I've got the stats here. But there are a broad range of the thematic ones, and we've got clean energy, we've got solar panels, we've got some impact investing funds. So, but a lot of them, I think, are thematic ones.
Right. Maybe, Calvin, this is a good point to come back to you on sort of impacts and metrics. And as an issuer, how do you go about at the issuer level thinking, what are the right metrics for your business? What's important to you? How do you gather data? How do you report data? How do you put together, as it were, your sustainability story to investors?
So over the last 5 years, this whole area has just exploded, right? And instead of kind of figuring it out ourselves, we've been working quite closely with different associations. For example, in the real estate sector, the essentially de facto sustainability benchmark for real estate, it's Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, GRESB. Working with them to kind of understand what's the baseline type of reporting requirements. Are we reporting absolute reduction in energy, or are we reporting energy intensity? If we're reporting energy intensity, what is the definition of meter squared? What's actually included in the calculation of square footage? Is it gross floor area? Is it internal floor area? And all of these issues do vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, cities to cities. But at least with working with the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, or RICS and ULI, we can actually align on some of the understandings of what metrics we use. So the beauty of that is then you end up reporting something consistent with other organizations, as opposed to using something that may be just applicable locally. That's been very useful to work with our investors who are all around the world, and kind of raising their awareness to it as well. The last thing that we really do a lot of is a lot of these global benchmarks, global committees that we're working on, because the methodologies are still being defined, right? We mentioned earlier, SASB and IIRC are collaborating on figuring out what the value creation network, how to measure that. IFRS is moving forward on coming out with their approach and methodology to account sustainability accounting as well. Being a part of that process has been very useful for us to determine whether we're on par, whether we have a lot to change on our upcoming reporting, what other types of data should we be collecting as well. So just really being a part of that global and regional community, and aligning with different players in the sector has been very useful.
Yeah, and Prashant, from your perspective, I guess this is what you're referring to in your slide there, different performance metrics, one of those areas where taxonomies can diverge. I mean, how big is this divergence? I forget the gentleman you quoted who said we were 80% aligned. I mean, if we're still arguing what a square meter is, are we really 80% aligned, or sort of how much work do we have to do here? Prashant, you're on mute, I think.
I think it's really the work that China and EU are doing. I think it's going to very much set the kind of conversation going everywhere else. So as soon as they align, I think there'll be quite a large kind of people following behind. I think the figure he was talking about was for the sectors in which they've both got comparable standards. There's good alignment, which I think is really, really encouraging. The disagreement, I think, is not going to be so much on the units of measure, because I think that the concepts are generally agreed. That when we talk about energy efficiency of buildings, we're talking about the carbon emissions per square meter. But it's the proxies that we use to measure those, because I think, as Calvin probably indicated, my recollection is that did Linkread use LEED plus, or did it? No. Well, often organisations will use local proxies, and it's that becomes a little bit more complicated. But I think with goodwill on everybody's side, we should try to get that line going. So same objective, yes. Often different sectoral coverage, and then it's the proxies I think are going to be a little bit more problematic.
Interesting. I mean, you raised one, and this is obviously very much in Calvin's space. I mean, energy per square meter or emissions per square meter. I mean, a couple of obvious issues that come out of that. I mean, to what extent do you control it if you are looking at emissions? Because obviously you presume you've got a lot of scope 2 in there that you don't control. So is energy a better metric? And the other part of the question is then, what if you're like Calvin and you've just launched and developed some of these sort of super smart, super green buildings?
Yeah.
Those metrics, you're going to find it very difficult to meet your other criteria that you want to find ambitious improvement. So how can we deal with those challenges?
You make a very, very valid point. So the climate bond standard was based on the CO2 emissions per meter square with appropriate climatic adjustments. So that was the kind of gold standard that we set ourselves. So obviously emissions in Australia, which is a warm climate, are going to be rather different to Iceland, which is a cold climate. So it's like for like basis. Now, in practice, often that data is not gathered. And that's the problem that most people encounter. So that's where the proxies sort of come in. So we need to accommodate data availability and climate, but everything else like age of building, et cetera, we're not sure that should be accommodated. I mean, a new building that Calvin is talking about is going to be better. On the other issues like water use, biodiversity, there's no simple solution here. The actual measurement issue is much easier on climate. It's much harder on some of the other things. And I mean, it'd be interesting. I think what we need to do is bring in other players into this. Some of the problems are quite intractable. I mean, something like biodiversity, it's a very, very location specific. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of work in India on adaptation to climate risks, and there it's almost on a watershed by watershed. Some areas have got too much water, some have got too little water. So the environmental problems might differ locationally as well. So I think we have to be guided by a wider community of people, of ecologists, of natural scientists, of social scientists as well. We're talking about inequality and some of those issues.
Great, thank you, Prashant. I'm conscious of time. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to do that dreadful moderator thing and ask everybody for sort of their concluding comment. And I'm going to pick that based on what you were going towards there, Prashant. Perhaps I'll start each of you in no more than 1 minute each to talk about, in the next 12 months, what are you going to be focused on to take this agenda of driving capital to sustainable investments forward? Prashant, can I come to you first on that?
I think the biggest challenge, and the one that we get pushed on in emerging markets, is making green capital cheaper. And at the moment, there is some evidence that the gap is there, but it's only a few basis points. I think we need regulators to come in. So that's the Ministry of Finance, some of the subsidy policies from other ministries and central banks to maybe change the risk weighting. So we need regulations to create that kind of green finance greenium.
Excellent. I should right behind you on that conversation, Prashant. Thank you. Calvin, as an issue, what are you focusing on? Where are you taking Link REIT next?
So our focus is really similar to what Prashant said. It's really working with the local players because our portfolio is primarily in Asia. A lot of the challenges will emerge here. And it's really about working with other players in Asia to align some of the reporting, the metrics, and the standards to be Asia specific, so that we can compare ourselves with the peers properly. And again, this is not something that we do by ourselves. It's collaborating with the industry in Asia across different sectors, investors, real estate companies, and financial institutions as well, aligning that understanding.
Excellent, thank you. Alexandra, you have the final word.
Probably for us, the focus would be improving the quality of the disclosures, not so much the quantity, but the quality of the disclosures, and also investor education as well, so that investors understand, you give them the information and they understand what they're doing with it.
And I guess quality would include assuring that data, which brings us back to members who I hope have enjoyed as much as I have the sharing of the immense experience from our three panelists across a really diverse set, but of critical players in this ecosystem of bringing more capital at better pricing to support the investments that are going to make the difference between a happy ending to this climate challenge and take us away from the rather depressing stories that perhaps many of us read and took away from the recent IPCC reports in terms of really the lack of progress that's been made to date. So a sobering note to end on, but with some optimism around the great work that certainly these three individuals are making. And with that, it really just remains for me to say thank you to all of our three panelists, to Alexandra, to Calvin, and to Prashant for joining us. And thank you all for joining. And until the next episode, thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.